Marcus Chen stared through his binoculars at the drowning bobcat 20 feet underwater, her swollen, pregnant belly visible as she fought desperately against the rope binding her to a massive rock. The deliberate knots told him this was murder, but he had less than 2 minutes to save 2 lives before the lake claimed them forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The murky waters of Lake Cascade in rural Idaho held secrets that most people would never discover, but on a humid August morning, those secrets were about to surface in the most horrifying way imaginable. The sun had barely crested the pine-covered mountains when Marcus Chen guided his fishing boat toward his favorite spot near the old timber bridge, the same place where his grandfather had taught him to fish 40 years ago. At 62, Marcus had seen plenty in his lifetime as a conservation officer, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to witness beneath the water's surface. The lake was unusually calm that morning, its glassy surface reflecting the surrounding wilderness like a perfect mirror. Marcus had retired from the Idaho Department of Fish and Game 3 years earlier, but old habits died hard. He still rose before dawn, still checked the wildlife cameras he maintained around the lake, and still felt that familiar pull toward the water that had defined most of his adult life. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of handling everything from injured eagles to aggressive bears, moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared his fishing rod. The morning air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, peaceful and serene. But then he saw it. A disturbance in the water near the bridge's support pillars, something that didn't belong. At first, Marcus thought it might be a large fish or perhaps debris caught in the current, but as his boat drifted closer, his trained eyes detected movement that was distinctly mammalian, desperate and struggling. His heart rate quickened as he cut the engine and reached for the binoculars he always kept in the console. What he saw through those lenses made his blood run cold. Approximately 20 feet below the surface, tethered to a massive river rock by thick rope, was a bobcat. The animal was alive, its powerful legs churning against the water in a futile attempt to reach the surface. Even from this distance, Marcus could see the desperation in its movements, the way its lungs must be screaming for air, the absolute terror of drowning slowly while being unable to break free. His hands trembled as he lowered the binoculars, his mind racing through possibilities. Who would do something like this? How long had the animal been down there? And most importantly, did he have enough time to save it? Marcus had performed countless wildlife rescues during his career, but this was different. The depth, the weight of the rock, the apparent cruelty involved, all of it pointed to something more sinister than an accidental entanglement. Someone had deliberately done this to a living creature, had tied that rope with intentional knots, had chosen a rock heavy enough to keep the animal submerged, and had thrown it into the lake with the clear purpose of killing it. The realization sent a wave of anger through Marcus that he hadn't felt in years, the kind of righteous fury that had driven him to become a conservation officer in the first place. Without wasting another second, Marcus grabbed his emergency dive bag from the storage compartment. Years of working in and around water had taught him to always be prepared, and he maintained a basic scuba setup on his boat for exactly these kinds of situations. His fingers, usually steady despite his age, fumbled slightly with the buckles and straps as adrenaline flooded his system. Every second counted. The bobcat had already been under for who knew how long, and its oxygen would be running out fast. As he secured the oxygen tank and checked his regulator, Marcus's mind flashed back to a conversation he'd had with his granddaughter just last week. Emily, bright-eyed and passionate about wildlife biology, had asked him why he still spent so much time on the lake even after retiring. He'd told her that the work never really stops when you care about something, that the animals don't respect retirement dates, and that every life saved was a small victory against the tide of human cruelty and indifference that threatened wildlife every day. He hadn't expected those words to be tested so dramatically, so soon. The water was cold as Marcus slipped beneath the surface, his wetsuit providing minimal insulation against the sudden temperature drop. Visibility was poor, the lake's natural sediment and algae creating a greenish haze that made navigation challenging. He followed the rope down, his dive light cutting through the murk, revealing more details that made the situation even more disturbing. The rope was new, the kind you could buy at any hardware store, tied with deliberate, practiced knots. This wasn't an accident or a cruel prank by ignorant teenagers. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. As Marcus descended deeper, the pressure building in his ears, he could finally see the bobcat clearly. The animal's struggles had weakened considerably, its movements becoming slower and less coordinated. But there was something else, something that made Marcus's heart clench with a mixture of rage and sorrow. The bobcat's abdomen was swollen, distinctly rounded in a way that was unmistakable to someone with his experience. She was pregnant, heavily pregnant by the looks of it, probably carrying a litter of 3 or 4 kits that would never see the light of day if he didn't act fast. The bobcat's golden eyes, dilated with fear and oxygen deprivation, locked onto Marcus as he approached. There was intelligence in that gaze, a desperate plea for help that transcended species barriers. In that moment, Marcus understood with crystal clarity what drove people like him and Emily to dedicate their lives to wildlife conservation. It wasn't about abstract concepts of ecological balance or biodiversity. It was about this, about looking into the eyes of a terrified, suffering creature and choosing to act, to fight against the cruelty and indifference that allowed such horrors to happen. Marcus pulled out his dive knife, its blade catching the weak light filtering down from above. The bobcat tensed, her maternal instincts probably screaming danger even in her weakened state, but there was nowhere for her to go, no escape from her underwater prison. Marcus worked quickly, sawing through the rope with sharp, efficient strokes. The fibers were thick and resistant, probably chosen specifically to prevent the animal from chewing through them. Each second felt like an eternity as he worked, his own air supply steadily depleting, his muscles burning from the effort. Finally, with a last desperate cut, the rope parted. The bobcat, freed from the weight of the rock, immediately began to rise, her body's natural buoyancy taking over, even as her weakened limbs struggled to assist. Marcus grabbed her carefully, mindful of her claws even in her current state, and began the ascent. His lungs screamed for air, his muscles protested the additional weight, but he pushed through, focusing on reaching the surface before it was too late for both of them. Breaking through the surface of Lake Cascade felt like emerging from a nightmare into harsh reality. Marcus gasped for air, his chest heaving as he struggled to keep both himself and the bobcat afloat. The pregnant female hung limp in his arms, her body eerily still, and for a terrible moment Marcus feared he had been too late. Water streamed from her spotted fur as he kicked toward his boat, each movement requiring every ounce of strength his aging body could muster. The morning sun, which had seemed so peaceful just minutes ago, now beat down with an urgency that matched his racing heart. Getting the unconscious bobcat onto the boat proved to be one of the most challenging physical tasks Marcus had attempted in years. His muscles trembled with exhaustion as he hauled himself over the side, then carefully lifted the waterlogged animal onto the deck. She was heavier than he expected, the weight of her pregnancy and the water saturating her fur combining to make her dead weight. Once she was safely aboard, Marcus collapsed beside her for just a moment, his own lungs still burning from the dive, before his training kicked back in and he began assessing her condition. The bobcat wasn't breathing. Her chest remained motionless, her mouth slightly open, revealing sharp canine teeth that spoke to the predator she was meant to be. Marcus had performed CPR on various animals throughout his career, from deer to dogs, but never on a wild bobcat, and certainly never on a pregnant one. The risks were enormous. Even if he could revive her, the stress might cause her to miscarry. but doing nothing guaranteed death for both mother and unborn kits. There was really no choice at all. Marcus positioned his hands carefully on the bobcat's ribcage, acutely aware of how fragile the situation was. Too much pressure could crack ribs or damage the developing kits. Too little would be ineffective. He began compressions, counting under his breath, his movements rhythmic and measured despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. After 30 compressions, he tilted her head back slightly, checked that her airway was clear, and began rescue breathing, sealing his mouth over her nose and delivering steady breaths. Nothing happened. Marcus continued the cycle, compressions and breaths, his arms beginning to ache, sweat dripping down his face despite the morning chill. He thought about calling for help, but his phone was in the waterproof case in the console, and stopping now could mean the difference between life and death. So he kept going, his rhythm never faltering, his determination absolute. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. The pattern became almost meditative, blocking out everything except the task at hand. Then, just as Marcus was beginning to lose hope, the bobcat convulsed. Water erupted from her mouth and nose as her body instinctively purged the lake from her lungs. Marcus quickly turned her onto her side, supporting her head as she coughed and gasped, her whole body shaking with the effort of breathing again. Her eyes flickered open, those golden orbs unfocused and filled with confusion and fear. Marcus backed away slightly, giving her space while still remaining close enough to assist if needed. The bobcat's breathing was ragged and labored, each inhale sounding wet and painful, but she was breathing. That was what mattered. Marcus grabbed an emergency blanket from his kit and carefully draped it over her, knowing that hypothermia was a serious risk after her ordeal in the cold water. She didn't protest, didn't try to move, simply lay there trembling as her body fought to recover from the trauma it had endured. Marcus could see her swollen belly rising and falling with each breath, and he sent up a silent prayer that the kits inside were still viable. Now came the difficult decision of what to do next. Marcus knew he needed to get this bobcat to professional veterinary care immediately, but the nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was over an hour away in Boise, and he had no way of knowing if she would survive the journey. His boat was equipped with basic first aid supplies, but nothing designed for a situation like this. He needed help, and he needed it fast. With trembling hands, Marcus retrieved his phone and called the one person he knew could help. Dr. Rachel Morrison had been the lead veterinarian at the Mountain West Wildlife Rehabilitation Center for 15 years, and she and Marcus had worked together on countless cases during his career. If anyone could save this bobcat and her unborn kits, it was Rachel. The phone rang 3 times before her familiar voice answered, professional and alert despite the early hour. Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. He quickly explained the situation, his words tumbling out in a rush as he described the drowning, the rescue, the successful resuscitation, and the bobcat's current precarious condition. Rachel listened without interrupting, and when Marcus finally paused for breath, her response was immediate and decisive. She would mobilize her emergency team right away, but given the distance and the severity of the situation, she needed Marcus to do something that would test every bit of his experience and courage. He needed to transport the bobcat to the nearest road access point, where Rachel's team could meet him with proper equipment. The problem was that the road was a good 20-minute boat ride, followed by a 10-minute drive in his truck, and during that entire time, he would be alone with a wild, traumatized, pregnant predator who could regain her strength at any moment. Rachel walked him through the steps of creating a makeshift transport carrier, using the emergency crate he kept on board and securing it in a way that would keep both him and the bobcat safe during the journey. As Marcus worked to prepare the carrier, following Rachel's instructions precisely, he found himself talking to the bobcat in a low, soothing voice. He told her about his granddaughter Emily, about his years protecting wildlife, about how he was going to do everything in his power to save her and her babies. The bobcat's eyes tracked his movements, still wary, but perhaps sensing that this human, at least, meant her no harm. Her breathing had steadied somewhat, though Marcus could still hear the concerning rattle in her lungs that suggested water remained. Getting the bobcat into the carrier proved surprisingly easy. She was still too weak to resist much, and Marcus was able to gently guide her inside with minimal struggle. He secured the door and positioned the carrier in the most stable part of the boat, surrounding it with cushions and his own jacket to minimize jostling during the ride. Then, with one last check that everything was secure, he started the engine and began the journey toward the road access point. The ride across the lake seemed to take forever, even though Marcus pushed the boat as fast as he dared. Every bump and wave made him wince, imagining the stress it was putting on the bobcat's already traumatized body. He kept glancing back at the carrier, watching for any signs of distress, ready to slow down if necessary. The bobcat remained quiet inside, her golden eyes visible through the ventilation slots, watching him with an intensity that was both unnerving and somehow reassuring. As the shore approached, Marcus could see his truck waiting in the small parking area where he'd left it before dawn. The next phase of the rescue was about to begin, and with it came new dangers and new uncertainties. Marcus's hands shook as he secured the carrier in the bed of his truck, using every bungee cord and strap he could find to ensure it wouldn't shift during the drive. The bobcat had remained eerily quiet during the transfer from boat to vehicle, her silence more concerning than any amount of hissing or growling would have been. A healthy wild bobcat would be fighting, protesting, doing everything possible to escape. This stillness suggested just how close to death she remained, how much the drowning and subsequent resuscitation had taken from her already stressed body. The drive to the meeting point took Marcus along winding mountain roads that he normally enjoyed, roads where he'd spent countless hours patrolling for poachers and checking on wildlife populations. But today, every pothole felt like a potential disaster, every sharp turn a threat to his precious cargo. He drove with exaggerated care, keeping his speed well below the limit, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, where he could just make out the edge of the carrier. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, promising another hot August day, and Marcus worried about the heat adding to the bobcat's stress. His phone rang through the truck's Bluetooth system, and Rachel's voice filled the cab with its characteristic blend of warmth and professional urgency. Her team was making excellent time, she reported, and should reach the meeting point in about 15 minutes. She asked Marcus a series of rapid-fire questions about the bobcat's condition, breathing rate, color of her gums, any signs of bleeding or discharge. Marcus answered as best he could, pulling over briefly to check on his patient when Rachel requested visual confirmation of certain symptoms. What he saw when he opened the carrier slightly made his heart sink. The bobcat's breathing had become more labored, each inhale accompanied by a visible shudder that ran through her entire body. Worse, there was a small amount of blood-tinged foam around her mouth, a sign that the water she'd inhaled had damaged her lungs more severely than he'd hoped. Marcus relayed this information to Rachel, hearing her sharp intake of breath even through the phone connection. She instructed him to keep the bobcat as calm and still as possible, and to get to the meeting point immediately, professional protocol giving way to frank urgency. The last few miles passed in a blur of anxiety and determination. Marcus found himself praying, something he hadn't done much of in recent years, asking whatever forces might be listening to give this mother and her unborn kits a chance at survival. She had already endured so much, had fought so hard to live. It seemed impossibly cruel for her story to end on this dusty mountain road, so close to help but not close enough. Finally, Marcus spotted the white van with the Mountain West Wildlife Rehabilitation Center logo emblazoned on its side, parked at the designated pullout with its emergency lights flashing. Rachel was already out of the vehicle, along with 2 technicians Marcus recognized from previous collaborations. They had transformed the pullout into an impromptu emergency treatment area, with equipment and supplies spread across a portable table in organized chaos that spoke to years of field experience. Rachel reached Marcus's truck before he'd even fully stopped, her sharp eyes already assessing the situation through the carrier's ventilation slots. At 53, she maintained the energetic intensity of someone half her age, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical braid, her movements efficient and purposeful. She'd saved hundreds of animals over her career, but Marcus could see the concern etched in the lines around her eyes as she got her first good look at the BOBCAT. The team worked with practice synchronization that came from years of emergency responses together. While Rachel performed a rapid physical examination through the carrier's door, her technicians prepared oxygen supplementation equipment and established a mobile monitoring station. Marcus stepped back, feeling suddenly useless after hours of being the BOBCAT's only hope, watching as these professionals took over with capabilities far beyond his own emergency training. Rachel's assessment was delivered in the clipped, precise language of veterinary emergency medicine, but Marcus understood enough to know the situation was critical. The BOBCAT was showing signs of aspiration pneumonia from the water in her lungs, her oxygen saturation was dangerously low, and her elevated stress hormones put her at extreme risk for pregnancy complications. Rachel made the decision to sedate her immediately, both to reduce stress and to allow for more thorough treatment, a risky call given the BOBCAT's already compromised respiratory function, but necessary given the alternatives. As the sedative took effect and the BOBCAT's struggles weakened, Rachel and her team were able to transfer her to a proper medical carrier equipped with monitoring equipment. Marcus watched as they placed an oxygen mask over her muzzle, the clear plastic fogging with each labored breath. Intravenous fluids were started, and Rachel performed an ultrasound right there in the parking area, her portable equipment revealing what everyone had been desperately hoping to see. The kits were still alive. 4 of them, their tiny hearts visible as rapid fluttering movements on the ultrasound screen, their development suggesting the mother was perhaps 6 weeks into her approximately 9-week gestation period. Rachel allowed herself a small smile of relief before her professional mask slipped back into place. The kits being alive was good news, but it also meant they now had 5 lives to save instead of 1, and the mother's treatment options would be limited by the need to avoid harming her unborn offspring. Marcus asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he'd first cut that rope underwater. What kind of person does something like this? Rachel's expression darkened as she examined the rope that Marcus had brought with him as evidence. She'd seen animal cruelty before, far too much of it, but there was something particularly vicious about this case. The deliberate nature of it, the time and effort required to capture a wild bobcat, tie a rock to her, and throw her into deep water, all of it spoke to a level of malice that went beyond simple ignorance or casual cruelty. One of Rachel's technicians, a young woman named Sarah with a background in criminal justice before she'd switched to wildlife rehabilitation, pointed out something Marcus had missed in his rush to save the bobcat. There were old scars on the animal's legs and face, marks that suggested previous human interaction, possibly trapping. This wasn't a random bobcat that someone had encountered and decided to kill on impulse. This was an animal that someone had specifically targeted, perhaps had captured before, and had chosen to kill in one of the cruelest ways imaginable. Rachel made a call to the Idaho Department of Fish and Game Enforcement Division, her professional obligation to report wildlife crimes overriding any desire to focus solely on medical treatment. Marcus listened as she detailed the case to the officer on duty, describing the rope, the rock, the deliberate nature of the drowning attempt, and the evidence of previous human-caused injuries. The officer promised to open an investigation immediately, asking Rachel to preserve all evidence and to keep him updated on the bobcat's condition and recovery location. As Rachel's team prepared to transport the Bobcat to their facility in Boise, Rachel pulled Marcus aside for a private conversation. Her expression was serious, her usual professional distance giving way to genuine emotion. She told him that what he'd done that morning, the dive, the resuscitation, the quick thinking and immediate action had given this Bobcat a chance she wouldn't have had otherwise. But she was also honest about the road ahead. The aspiration pneumonia was severe, the stress on the pregnancy was extreme, and there was no guarantee that mother or kits would survive the next 48 hours. Marcus nodded, accepting the reality of the situation while refusing to let go of hope. He'd seen animals recover from seemingly impossible injuries before, had witnessed the remarkable resilience of wildlife when given proper care and a fighting chance. This Bobcat had already proven herself a survivor, had already fought through drowning and resuscitation. If anyone could beat the odds, Marcus believed it was her. He asked Rachel to keep him updated, to call him day or night with any news, good or bad. She promised she would, then surprised him by pulling him into a brief hug, a rare break in her professional composure. The Mountain West Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had been designed specifically for critical care situations like this, but even with all their advanced equipment and experienced staff, the next several hours would test everyone's skills and endurance. Rachel's team moved with choreographed precision as they transferred the sedated Bobcat from the transport carrier to the center's intensive care unit, a specialized room equipped with climate control, oxygen supplementation systems, and monitoring equipment that would track every vital sign around the clock. The Bobcat, whom the staff had begun calling Cascade in honor of the lake where she'd nearly died, was positioned carefully on a heated pad that would help maintain her body temperature while the team worked. Rachel scrubbed in for what would be the most delicate examination of her career, knowing that every decision she made over the next few hours could mean the difference between saving this family or losing them all. Her hands, steady despite the pressure, moved with practiced gentleness as she began the thorough assessment that would guide their treatment plan. The aspiration pneumonia was worse than Rachel had feared. Cascade's lungs were severely compromised, with both lower lobes showing significant fluid accumulation and inflammation. The water she'd inhaled had carried lake bacteria deep into her respiratory system, creating a perfect environment for infection. Rachel started aggressive antibiotic therapy, choosing medications that were safe for pregnancy while still being effective against the most common waterborne pathogens. Every treatment decision required this kind of delicate balancing act, weighing the mother's needs against potential risks to the developing kits. Sarah, the technician with the criminal justice background, worked alongside Rachel, documenting everything with meticulous detail. Photographs were taken of every old scar, every injury, creating a comprehensive record that would be crucial for the criminal investigation. She measured and cataloged the rope burns on Cascade's neck and legs, evidence of how frantically the Bobcat had struggled against her restraints underwater. The rope itself had been preserved in an evidence bag, its knots photographed from multiple angles, its composition noted for future analysis. As Rachel worked, she explained her findings to the assembled team, her voice calm and educational despite the gravity of the situation. Cascade's previous injuries told a story of survival against human cruelty that went beyond this single drowning attempt. There were old fractures in her left forepaw that had healed incorrectly, probably from a leg-hold trap. Scars across her shoulders suggested she'd been caught in wire snares at some point. Someone had been tormenting this animal for possibly years, and the drowning attempt appeared to be their most recent and most vicious attack. The ultrasound examination revealed both hope and concern. All 4 kits showed strong heartbeats, their tiny forms clearly visible as they floated in their protected environment, unaware of the trauma their mother had endured. But the stress hormones flooding Cascade's system could trigger premature labor at any time, and at 6 weeks of development, the kits would have virtually no chance of survival outside the womb. Rachel made the difficult decision to administer medications that would help prevent premature contractions, another calculated risk in a situation where every choice carried potential consequences. Meanwhile, back at Lake Cascade, the investigation into the attempted killing was already underway. Officer Daniel Reeves of the Idaho Department of Fish and Game had arrived at the scene within an hour of Rachel's call, bringing with him a team that included a wildlife forensics specialist and a crime scene photographer. Daniel had been working wildlife crimes for 12 years, but cases involving deliberate, sustained cruelty always affected him deeply. This wasn't poaching for meat or trophy hunting gone wrong. This was torture, pure and simple, directed at an animal that posed no threat to anyone. The location where Marcus had found Cascade provided the first crucial clues. The bridge support pillar where she'd been tied was accessible only by boat, meaning whoever had done this had planned the attack carefully. They'd needed to capture Cascade alive, transport her to the lake, attach the rock and rope, and sink her in a specific location that was deep enough to ensure drowning, but shallow enough to reach without specialized diving equipment. This level of premeditation suggested either significant local knowledge or previous reconnaissance of the area. Daniel's forensic specialist, a meticulous woman named Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, examined the rope and rock that Marcus had preserved. The rope was standard marine-grade line, available at dozens of stores throughout Idaho, but the knots were distinctive. Patricia identified them as commercial fishing knots, the kind used by people who worked on boats professionally or as serious hobbyists. The rock showed recent tool marks, suggesting it had been shaped or modified to better serve as an anchor weight. Someone had put thought and effort into this murder attempt. Back at the rehabilitation center, Cascade began showing signs of emerging from sedation. Rachel had deliberately used a lighter dose than she might normally employ, knowing that keeping a wild animal under for extended periods carried its own risks. As Cascade's awareness returned, her breathing became more agitated, her body tensing against the unfamiliar surroundings and the presence of humans. Rachel had anticipated this reaction and had prepared accordingly, dimming the lights in the intensive care unit and ensuring that only essential personnel remained in the room. The challenge now was to provide necessary medical care while minimizing stress that could harm both Cascade and her unborn kits. Rachel had years of experience with wild felines, understanding that their fear responses were deeply hardwired and that traditional veterinary handling techniques needed to be modified significantly when working with animals that had never been domesticated. She spoke in low, soothing tones, not because she believed Cascade understood her words, but because tone and volume could help reduce threat perception. Cascade's golden eyes, now fully open and alert, tracked every movement in the room with the focused intensity of a predator assessing danger. Rachel could see the intelligence behind that gaze, could recognize the calculations being made about escape routes and threats. This was an animal that had survived against terrible odds, that had learned to fear humans with good reason, and that was now trapped in the most vulnerable position possible, injured and pregnant, in an enclosed space, surrounded by the very species that had tried to kill her. The first real test came when Rachel needed to check Cascade's breathing and adjust her oxygen supplementation. Approaching a conscious wild bobcat, even an injured one, required courage and precise timing. Rachel moved slowly and deliberately, using a specialized squeeze cage that allowed her to gently restrict Cascade's movement without causing additional stress or injury. The bobcat hissed and growled, her ears flattened against her skull, but she was still too weak to mount a serious resistance. Rachel's examination revealed what she'd feared, but hoped to avoid. Cascade's breathing was getting worse, not better. The aspiration pneumonia was progressing despite the antibiotics, and fluid was continuing to accumulate in her lungs. Rachel made the difficult decision to increase oxygen supplementation and add nebulizer treatments that would help clear the fluid and deliver medication directly to the affected tissue. Each treatment would require handling Cascade multiple times a day, each interaction carrying risks for everyone involved. As the day wore on, Marcus called for updates every few hours, his voice betraying the anxiety he tried to keep professional. Rachel gave him honest assessments, never sugarcoating the severity of Cascade's condition, but also emphasizing the small victories. Her vital signs were stabilizing. The kits were still showing strong heartbeats. She was accepting small amounts of fluids. These incremental improvements were all they could hope for in the critical first 24 hours, but they represented the difference between a patient who was actively dying and one who was fighting to survive. The evening brought a development that both encouraged and worried Rachel's team. Cascade had begun eating on her own, tentatively accepting small pieces of raw meat that had been offered. This was excellent news from a recovery standpoint, indicating that her body was beginning to heal and rebuild strength. But it also meant she was regaining her natural vigor, which would make treatment increasingly difficult and dangerous. A healthy wild bobcat was one of nature's most formidable predators, equipped with razor-sharp claws, powerful jaws, and lightning-fast reflexes honed by millions of years of evolution. By the third day of Cascade's recovery, the rehabilitation center had settled into a careful routine that balanced medical necessity against the bobcat's increasing stress. Rachel had assembled a core team of 3 people who would handle all interactions with Cascade, limiting the number of unfamiliar faces and scents that might trigger additional anxiety. The intensive care unit had been modified to include visual barriers that allowed Cascade some sense of privacy while still permitting constant monitoring of her vital signs through strategically placed cameras. The pneumonia showed signs of improvement, though Rachel remained cautiously optimistic rather than celebratory. Cascade's breathing had become less labored, and the fluid in her lungs was gradually clearing thanks to the aggressive treatment regimen. But the real miracle, the development that had everyone at the center talking in hushed, hopeful tones, was that the pregnancy remained stable. All 4 kits continued to show strong heartbeats during daily ultrasounds, their small bodies developing normally despite the catastrophic stress their mother had endured. Marcus had become a daily visitor to the center, unable to stay away from the animal he'd risked his life to save. Rachel had initially been hesitant about allowing him into the intensive care area, concerned that additional human presence might set back Cascade's recovery. But something remarkable happened during his first visit. When Marcus approached Cascade's enclosure and spoke to her in that same low, soothing voice he'd used during the rescue, the bobcat's response was measurably different than it was to other humans. Her stress indicators didn't spike the way they did with staff members. Her pupils didn't dilate quite as dramatically. It was as if some part of her recognized him, remembered him as the human who had pulled her from drowning darkness and breathed life back into her lungs. To her, Rachel, ever the scientist, documented this phenomenon carefully. Animal cognition was a field that continued to surprise researchers, and Cascade's apparent recognition of Marcus challenged assumptions about how wild animals processed trauma and formed associations. She theorized that the extreme circumstances of the rescue had created a unique bond, a connection forged in that underwater moment when Marcus had become Cascade's only lifeline between death and survival. Whatever the mechanism, Marcus's presence seemed to have a calming effect that couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Reeves's investigation had begun to bear fruit. The distinctive fishing knots on the rope had led him to interview commercial fishermen and serious recreational anglers in the Lake Cascade area. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. A bait shop owner named Tom Henderson mentioned a customer who'd been asking unusual questions about bobcat behavior and habitat in the weeks leading up to Cascade's drowning. The customer had claimed to be a wildlife photographer, but something about his questions had struck Tom as off, more focused on how to capture or trap the animals than how to photograph them. Tom's description led Daniel to Gerald Pritchard, a 54-year-old former commercial fisherman who lived in an isolated cabin about 3 miles from the lake. Gerald had a record of minor wildlife violations, mostly related to fishing without proper licenses and exceeding catch limits, but nothing that had suggested a capacity for the kind of cruelty Cascade had suffered. Daniel obtained a warrant to search Gerald's property, and what they found there painted a disturbing picture of escalating violence toward wildlife. The cabin was cluttered with animal traps of various designs, some legal and some decidedly not. In Gerald's workshop, investigators found ropes identical to the one used to bind Cascade, cut from the same spool. But most damning was a journal, handwritten entries that detailed Gerald's growing obsession with a particular bobcat that had been, in his words, stealing fish from his private pond. The entries began reasonably enough, expressing frustration at losing stock trout to what he considered a pest. But they quickly descended into disturbing descriptions of failed attempts to trap the bobcat, each failure met with increasing anger and more violent proposed solutions. The final entry, dated the day before Marcus found Cascade in the lake, described Gerald's plan in chilling detail. He'd finally caught the bobcat using a cage trap baited with fresh fish. Rather than relocating her humanely or contacting wildlife authorities, he'd decided to kill her in a way that would, as he wrote, make sure she never stole from him again. The drowning was meant to be a final solution, a way to eliminate the problem animal while making it look like an accident if the body was ever discovered. Daniel arrested Gerald that evening, charging him with felony animal cruelty and violations of the Endangered Species Act. Idaho law had been strengthened in recent years to provide serious penalties for wildlife crimes, and the deliberate torture of a protected species carried potential prison time. Gerald's initial response was defensive, claiming he'd only been protecting his property from a pest. But when Daniel showed him the photographs of Cascade's injuries, both new and old, and explained that the pregnant bobcat was fighting for her life because of his actions, something in Gerald's expression shifted. It wasn't quite remorse, Daniel thought, but perhaps the first glimmer of understanding that what he'd done crossed a line that society wouldn't tolerate. Back at the rehabilitation center, Rachel received the news of the arrest with grim satisfaction. Justice for Cascade wouldn't undo the trauma or heal the scars, but it might prevent this particular human from harming other animals in the future. She shared the update with her team during their evening briefing, and Sarah suggested they tell Marcus as soon as possible. He'd been carrying the weight of wondering who could have done such a thing, and knowing the perpetrator had been caught might provide some closure. When Rachel called Marcus that night, his reaction was complex. Relief that someone was being held accountable mixed with anger that seemed to surprise even him. He'd spent his career trying to bridge the gap between humans and wildlife, teaching people to appreciate and respect the natural world. Cases like this challenged his fundamental belief that most people, given proper education and understanding, would choose to coexist peacefully with wildlife rather than harm it. Gerald's deliberate cruelty represented a darkness that education alone couldn't address. As they talked, Rachel mentioned something she'd been considering. Once Cascade recovered enough to be moved from intensive care, she would need months of rehabilitation before any release could be considered. The challenge would be providing that rehabilitation in a way that didn't further tame or habituate her to humans. Wild bobcats who lost their fear of people rarely survived long in the wild, either because they approached dangerous situations or because they were killed by people who felt threatened by their boldness. Cascade needed to remain wild, needed to retain or rebuild her healthy fear of humans, despite all the medical intervention she was receiving. Rachel had an idea, but it was unconventional and would require resources and expertise beyond what the center normally provided. She wanted to create a specialized rehabilitation environment for Cascade, a large, naturalistic enclosure where she could give birth and raise her kits with minimal human contact. The enclosure would be equipped with remote monitoring systems that would allow the team to observe and provide medical care when necessary, without constant direct interaction. It was an ambitious plan, and implementing it would require fundraising and probably volunteer labor, but Rachel believed it was Cascade's best chance at eventually returning to the wild. Marcus listened to Rachel's proposal with growing excitement. This was exactly the kind of innovative wildlife management he'd always advocated for, solutions that prioritize the animal's needs over human convenience. He offered to help however he could, whether that meant physical labor building the enclosure or using his contacts in the conservation community to raise funds and awareness. The story of Cascade's rescue and recovery had the potential to inspire people, to remind them why wildlife protection mattered and what was possible when humans chose to help rather than harm. As the conversation wound down, Rachel shared one final piece of news that brought tears to Marcus's eyes. Cascade had shown maternal behaviors for the first time that day, carefully grooming her swollen belly with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with her fearful aggression toward humans. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it suggested that despite everything she'd endured, Cascade's maternal instincts remained intact. Those 4 kits growing inside her still had a mother who would fight to protect them, who had already survived impossible odds to give them a chance at life. The news of Cascade's story spread through Idaho's conservation community with remarkable speed. Rachel had initially shared updates only with close colleagues and stakeholders, but Marcus had mentioned the case to his granddaughter Emily, who was studying wildlife biology at Boise State University. Emily, with the passionate energy of youth and the communication skills of her generation, had created a carefully worded social media post about Cascade's rescue and recovery, being mindful to protect the bobcat's privacy while conveying the importance of the case. The response was overwhelming. Within 48 hours, Emily's post had been shared thousands of times, crossing state lines and reaching wildlife advocates across the country. Donations began arriving at the rehabilitation center, some as small as $5 from elementary school students who'd been moved by Cascade's story, others substantial contributions from conservation organizations and foundations. Rachel found herself conducting interviews with local news stations, carefully balancing the need to raise awareness and funds against the risk of turning Cascade into a spectacle. What struck Rachel most profoundly during these interviews was how Cascade's story seemed to resonate with people on a deeply emotional level. She represented something more than just one animal's suffering and survival. In a world that often felt overwhelming and hopeless, where news of environmental destruction and species extinction dominated headlines, Cascade offered something precious: proof that individual action could make a difference, that cruelty didn't have to win, and that nature's resilience could triumph when given a fighting chance. The fundraising success meant that Rachel's ambitious rehabilitation plan could become reality. A local construction company, moved by Cascade's story, offered to donate materials and labor for the specialized enclosure. Environmental engineers volunteered their expertise to design a space that would replicate natural bobcat habitat, while incorporating the monitoring and care systems Rachel needed. Within 2 weeks of the campaign launching, construction began on what everyone at the center had started calling Cascade's Sanctuary. The enclosure was designed to be a marvel of wildlife rehabilitation engineering. Spanning nearly an acre, it featured multiple elevation levels with rocky outcroppings, dense vegetation for cover, fallen logs that would serve as hunting practice grounds, and a small stream system that would attract natural prey species. The perimeter was secured with specialized fencing that would keep Cascade safely contained while being virtually invisible from inside, maintaining the illusion of natural wilderness. Hidden cameras were strategically placed to monitor every area without requiring human presence, and a sophisticated remote feeding system would allow the team to provide supplemental nutrition if needed without direct contact. Meanwhile, Cascade continued her recovery in the intensive care unit, her strength returning day by day. By the end of the second week, she was no longer requiring oxygen supplementation, and her lungs had cleared significantly. The antibiotics had successfully fought off the infection from the lake water, and her appetite had returned with a vengeance. She was consuming nearly 3 pounds of meat daily, her body working overtime to support both her own healing and the rapid growth of the 4 kits developing inside her. Rachel began the delicate process of reducing direct human contact with Cascade in preparation for her eventual move to the sanctuary. Treatment times were shortened and made as efficient as possible. The team worked in silence during their interactions with her, avoiding eye contact and minimizing any behaviors that might build familiarity or trust. It seemed counterintuitive, almost cruel, to deliberately maintain Cascade's fear and wariness of humans when she was under their care. But this fear was essential for her survival in the wild, a necessary barrier that would protect her from approaching dangerous situations or humans with bad intentions. Marcus struggled with this aspect of Cascade's rehabilitation more than he'd expected. During his visits, which Rachel had reluctantly agreed to continue, given their apparent calming effect, he found himself wanting to connect with Cascade, to somehow communicate that not all humans were monsters like Gerald Pritchard. But Rachel's gentle reminders helped him understand that the kindest thing he could do for Cascade was to maintain his distance, to let her heal while preserving the wildness that defined her species. The construction of Cascade's sanctuary progressed with remarkable speed, driven by volunteer enthusiasm and professional expertise. Local news coverage of the project brought even more supporters, including high school biology classes, who spent weekends helping plant native vegetation, and college environmental clubs who assisted with habitat feature installation. The project became a community effort, a collective statement that the people of Idaho valued their wildlife and were willing to work to protect it. 3 weeks after her rescue, Cascade reached a critical milestone. Her pregnancy had progressed to approximately 8 weeks, with the kits now fully formed and approaching the developmental stage where they could potentially survive outside the womb. Rachel's daily ultrasound showed 4 healthy kits, their tiny bodies clearly visible, their movements increasingly active as they grew stronger. The largest appeared to be a male, his features already showing the distinctive structure that would eventually make him a formidable predator. The 3 smaller ones were likely females, though it was difficult to be certain at this stage. The timing of Cascade's sanctuary completion couldn't have been better. Just as the enclosure received its final inspections and was declared ready for occupancy, Rachel made the assessment that Cascade was stable enough to be moved from intensive care. The transfer would be risky, potentially stressful enough to trigger premature labor, but the alternative of keeping Cascade in the small intensive care unit for several more weeks carried its own dangers. A wild animal confined in a small space for extended periods could develop psychological problems that would make rehabilitation impossible. The move was planned with military precision. Rachel's team spent days rehearsing every step, anticipating potential complications and developing contingency plans. They would sedate Cascade lightly, just enough to reduce stress during the transport without putting the pregnancy at risk. The route from the intensive care building to the sanctuary had been cleared and secured. Emergency equipment would be staged at both locations in case immediate medical intervention became necessary. Every member of the team understood their role and the importance of executing it flawlessly. The morning of the transfer dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for minimizing additional stress. Marcus had asked to be present, and Rachel agreed, positioning him at the sanctuary where he could help monitor Cascade's initial response to her new environment. As the sun climbed over the mountains, casting long shadows across the rehabilitation center, Rachel administered the mild sedative and waited for it to take effect. Cascade's response to the medication was textbook perfect. Her movement slowed, her awareness dimmed just enough to make handling safe, but she remained conscious enough that her respiratory system wasn't compromised. The team worked with practiced efficiency, transferring her into a specialized transport carrier designed to minimize jostling and maintain stable temperature. The short drive from the intensive care building to the sanctuary felt interminable to everyone involved, each small bump in the road causing collective held breath. At the sanctuary, the final phase of the transfer began. The carrier was positioned at the entrance to a specially designed den area, a protected space within the larger enclosure where Cascade would likely choose to give birth. The door was opened remotely, allowing Cascade to emerge on her own timeline without human pressure. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, cautiously, Cascade stepped out into her new environment. The transformation in her demeanor was immediate and striking. In the intensive care unit, even as she'd grown stronger, Cascade had remained tense and hypervigilant, her body language broadcasting constant stress and the desire to escape. But here, in this carefully crafted wilderness space, something fundamental shifted. Her ears, which had been perpetually flattened in defensive posture, rotated forward with interest. Her tail, which had been tucked tight against her body, relaxed into a more natural position. She began to explore, moving with increasing confidence through the undergrowth, investigating the rocky outcroppings and water features with obvious approval. Marcus watched Cascade's exploration through the remote monitoring station with emotions he couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly, at seeing her move through the sanctuary with growing confidence. Relief that she'd accepted the new environment without the catastrophic stress response they'd all feared. But there was also a profound sense of witnessing something sacred, watching this wild creature reclaim the autonomy and dignity that Gerald Pritchard had tried to steal from her. Rachel stood beside him, making quiet notes about Cascade's behavior patterns and preferences as she explored every corner of her new territory. Over the following days, Cascade settled into the sanctuary with remarkable adaptability. She claimed the prepared den as her own, spending increasing amounts of time there as her pregnancy advanced into its final stages. The remote monitoring system allowed Rachel's team to observe her without intrusion, watching as she arranged bedding materials and prepared the space with the meticulous care of an expectant mother. Her appetite remained strong, and the automated feeding system worked flawlessly, delivering fresh meat to designated locations that Cascade quickly learned to check. The community's investment in Cascade's recovery extended beyond financial contributions. Local schools incorporated her story into their science curricula, using her case to teach lessons about wildlife biology, ecosystem balance, and conservation ethics. Emily, Marcus's granddaughter, developed an educational presentation about Cascade that she delivered to groups throughout Idaho, always careful to emphasize that the goal was Cascade's eventual return to the wild, not her transformation into a permanent exhibit or mascot. The line between raising awareness and exploitation was delicate, and Emily navigated it with wisdom beyond her years. Gerald Pritchard's criminal case moved through the legal system with unusual speed, perhaps driven by public attention to Cascade's story, or perhaps by the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. His defense attorney attempted to argue that Gerald had been protecting his property from a pest species, but the prosecution countered with expert testimony about bobcat behavior and the economic and ecological value of predators in Idaho's ecosystems. The handwritten journal entries describing in disturbing detail Gerald's escalating violence toward Cascade proved particularly damning. The trial became a landmark case for wildlife crime prosecution in Idaho. Environmental law experts from across the country followed the proceedings, recognizing that the outcome could set important precedents for how society addressed animal cruelty cases involving wildlife. The prosecution presented Cascade's case not just as the abuse of one animal, but as an assault on Idaho's natural heritage and the public trust doctrine that held wildlife as belonging to all citizens, not just the individual who wanted to eliminate them. During the trial, Rachel was called to testify as an expert witness. She described in clinical detail the injuries Cascade had suffered, both from the drowning attempt and from previous encounters with traps and snares. She explained the rarity of successful resuscitation after drowning in wildlife cases, making it clear that Cascade's survival was exceptional and that Gerald's actions had been designed to ensure death, not just removal of a nuisance animal. When shown photographs of Cascade's recovery and the sanctuary built for her rehabilitation, several jury members were visibly moved. Marcus also testified, describing the underwater rescue and the desperate fight to save Cascade's life. His testimony carried weight, not just because of the dramatic rescue, but because of his 30 years of professional experience in wildlife management. He spoke about the broader implications of cases like this, how they undermined public trust in conservation programs and created fear and wariness in wildlife populations that could persist for generations. A traumatized mother bobcat, he explained, could pass fear of humans to her offspring, affecting how those animals interacted with people throughout their lives. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Gerald Pritchard was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 3 years of probation, a lifetime ban on hunting and fishing in Idaho, and substantial fines that would be directed to wildlife rehabilitation programs. It was one of the harshest sentences ever imposed for wildlife crime in Idaho's history, and conservation groups across the state celebrated it as a turning point in how seriously the legal system took animal cruelty cases. Back at the sanctuary, Cascade remained unaware of the legal drama surrounding her case, focused instead on the imminent arrival of her kits. Rachel's monitoring showed all the classic signs that birth was approaching. Cascade's nesting behavior intensified, and she spent hours arranging and rearranging her den. Her appetite decreased slightly, normal as her body prepared for labor. The remote cameras captured her pacing, restless movements that suggested early contractions had begun. Rachel assembled her team for what could be either routine observation or emergency intervention, depending on how the birth progressed. They would watch remotely, ready to act if complications arose, but hoping desperately that nature would take its course without requiring human interference. The last thing Cascade needed after everything she'd endured was another traumatic interaction with humans during what should be one of the most instinctive and natural processes in her life. The birth began late one evening, just as the last light faded from the sky. Through the infrared cameras, Rachel and her team watched as Cascade moved through the stages of labor with the ancient knowledge encoded in her DNA. The first kit arrived after approximately 2 hours, a small, wet bundle that Cascade immediately began cleaning with her rough tongue. She stimulated the kit's breathing, cleared its airways, and guided it toward her belly, where it latched on and began nursing within minutes of birth. The second and third kits followed at roughly 30-minute intervals, each birth proceeding smoothly, despite Rachel's nervousness. But the fourth kit, the largest one they'd seen on the ultrasounds, took longer. Cascade showed signs of distress, panting heavily and making low vocalizations that suggested pain beyond the normal discomfort of labor. Rachel's hand hovered over the emergency intervention button, ready to mobilize her team if necessary, but she forced herself to wait, to give Cascade's body time to work through what might be a normal, if difficult, delivery. After nearly an hour of intense labor, the fourth kit finally emerged. Cascade, exhausted but driven by maternal instinct, immediately began the cleaning and stimulation process. For several tense minutes, the kit didn't respond, lying motionless while its mother worked frantically to revive it. Rachel felt her heart sink, preparing to witness the tragic loss that sometimes accompanied even successful births. But then, just as she was about to activate the intervention protocol, the kit moved. A small, weak movement at first, but enough to show that life persisted. Within minutes, all 4 kits were nursing, their tiny bodies pressed against their mother's warmth, their survival against all odds a testament to Cascade's fierce will to protect her offspring. Rachel found herself crying openly, something she rarely allowed herself to do even in private. The weight of the past weeks, the stress and fear and desperate hope, all released in tears of relief and joy. Around her, her team members weren't even trying to hide their own emotional responses. They'd saved not just 1 life, but 5, and in doing so had struck a blow against the cruelty and indifference that threatened wildlife everywhere. Marcus, watching from his home through the live feed Rachel had given him access to, called immediately. His voice was thick with emotion as he congratulated Rachel and her team, as he marveled at the tiny miracles that had just entered the world against such impossible odds. They talked long into the night, watching the remote cameras as Cascade tended to her newborns, processing what this moment meant, not just for these individual animals, but for everyone who'd invested time, money, and hope into their survival. The kits, like all newborn bobcats, were blind and helpless, dependent entirely on their mother for warmth, food, and protection. But they were alive, and that was everything. Over the coming weeks, they would grow and develop, learning from Cascade how to be bobcats, how to hunt and hide and survive in the wild. If all went well, in approximately 8 to 9 months, they would be ready for release. 5 wild bobcats returning to Idaho's forests instead of the one that Gerald Pritchard had tried to murder. The first weeks of the kits' lives passed in a blur of constant monitoring and careful non-interference. Rachel and her team watched through the remote cameras as Cascade proved herself to be an exemplary mother, attentive and protective in ways that belied the trauma she'd endured. The kits, 2 males and 2 females, as later observations confirmed, thrived under her care. Their eyes opened after about 10 days, revealing the brilliant blue color that would eventually change to the golden yellow of adult bobcats. Their tiny ears, initially folded flat against their heads, began to stand upright, and their spotted coats became more distinct as their fur grew in. Cascade's maternal behaviors provided invaluable data for Rachel's research into bobcat rehabilitation. The remote monitoring system captured behaviors that were rarely observed in wild populations, offering insights into how mother bobcats taught their offspring essential survival skills. Even in the confined space of the sanctuary, Cascade demonstrated hunting techniques, bringing in the food provided by the automated system and allowing the kits to practice pouncing and grasping before actually eating. These play behaviors, which to casual observers might seem like simple entertainment, were actually critical training sessions that would determine whether the kits could successfully hunt on their own once released. Marcus visited the monitoring station almost daily, unable to stay away from the family he'd saved. He brought Emily with him frequently, and Rachel welcomed the young woman's fresh perspective and technological expertise. Emily had proposed creating a documentary about Cascade's journey, from the drowning attempt through rehabilitation to eventual release, arguing that the educational value could inspire conservation efforts far beyond Idaho. Rachel was initially hesitant, concerned about exploitation and privacy, but Emily's thoughtful approach and commitment to prioritizing the animal's welfare eventually won her over. The documentary project required careful planning to ensure it didn't interfere with Cascade's rehabilitation or compromise the kit's wild development. Emily worked with a professional wildlife filmmaker who specialized in remote, non-invasive documentation techniques. They used the existing camera system, supplemented with additional angles that provided comprehensive coverage without requiring any human presence in the sanctuary. The resulting footage was extraordinary, capturing intimate moments of family life that few people ever witnessed in wild bobcats. As the kits grew, their individual personalities began to emerge. The largest male, whom the team privately called Summit in honor of the rocky outcropping he loved to climb, showed exceptional boldness and curiosity. He was always the first to investigate new elements in the environment and demonstrated hunting skills that impressed even Rachel's experienced eye. The smaller male, given the unofficial name River for his fascination with the sanctuary's water features, was more cautious but showed remarkable problem-solving abilities, often finding creative solutions to challenges that stumped his siblings. The two females displayed equally distinct personalities. The larger one, nicknamed Meadow for her preference for the sanctuary's open grassy areas, was fiercely competitive and often initiated playfights with her brothers. The smallest of the litter, affectionately called Shadow for her tendency to stay close to Cascade and hide in darker areas, was the most observant and seemed to learn by watching rather than through trial and error. Rachel cautioned the team against becoming too attached to these personalities, reminding them that the kits were wild animals destined for release, not pets or permanent residents. When the kits reached 3 months of age, Rachel began introducing live prey into the sanctuary. She started with mice and small rabbits, released through a sophisticated system that prevented the prey from escaping the enclosure while allowing them to behave naturally. This was a critical phase in the kit's development, the transition from play hunting to actual predation. Cascade led by example, demonstrating proper stalking, pouncing, and killing techniques while allowing her offspring to practice and make mistakes. The introduction of live prey raised ethical questions that Rachel addressed head-on during interviews about the project. Some people objected to feeding live animals to the bobcats, viewing it as cruel and unnecessary. Rachel explained patiently that teaching the kits to hunt live prey was essential for their survival in the wild, that releasing them without these skills would be condemning them to starvation. She also pointed out that in nature, bobcats killed to survive every single day, and that what happened in the sanctuary was no different from what occurred in forests across Idaho, just observed and facilitated by humans committed to these animals' successful return to the wild. Gerald Pritchard's imprisonment didn't end the legal ramifications of Cascade's case. Environmental advocacy groups used the trial's outcome to push for stronger wildlife protection legislation in Idaho. A bill was introduced in the state legislature that would increase penalties for wildlife crimes and provide additional funding for rehabilitation facilities and law enforcement training. The bill, informally known as Cascade's Law, generated heated debate between conservation advocates and property rights groups who worried about government overreach. Emily threw herself into advocacy for the bill, testifying before legislative committees and organizing student support campaigns. She brought photographs and video footage from Cascade's rehabilitation, making the abstract concept of wildlife crime painfully concrete for legislators who'd never considered the issue deeply. Marcus, drawing on his decades of experience and professional credibility, provided expert testimony about the ecological and economic importance of predator conservation. Together, their efforts helped build bipartisan support for the legislation. The bill's passage, 6 months after Cascade's rescue, represented a significant victory for wildlife advocates. It increased felony penalties for deliberate wildlife torture, created a dedicated wildlife crime investigation unit within the Department of Fish and Game, and established a fund for rehabilitation facilities like Rachel's Center. Gerald Pritchard's case had created ripples that extended far beyond one bobcat and her kits, changing how Idaho approached wildlife protection at a systemic level. As spring arrived in Idaho, Cascade's kits approached 6 months of age, the point at which wild bobcat mothers typically begin encouraging independence in their offspring. Rachel observed this transition through the remote cameras with fascination. Cascade became less tolerant of her kit's constant presence, sometimes hissing or swatting when they tried to nurse or crowd her personal space. The kits responded by spending more time apart from their mother and each other, exploring different areas of the sanctuary and developing more solitary habits. This natural separation process was crucial for eventual release. Bobcats were primarily solitary animals once they reached adulthood, coming together only for mating. If Cascade's kits remained too dependent on each other or on their mother, they would struggle to establish individual territories after release. Rachel's rehabilitation protocol called for maintaining the family group until the kits were approximately 8 to 9 months old, allowing them to complete their learning phase while encouraging increasing independence. The sanctuary's design proved its worth during this period. With nearly an acre of varied terrain, the kits could establish separate core areas within the enclosure, mimicking the territorial behavior they would exhibit in the wild. Summit claimed the rocky eastern section, River dominated the stream area, Meadow preferred the open grasslands, and Shadow found security in the dense vegetation near Cascade's original den. They still interacted during hunts and feeding times, but these interactions became briefer and more focused, less playful and more businesslike. Rachel began planning for release, a complex process that required identifying suitable habitat, coordinating with wildlife managers to ensure the areas could support additional bobcats, and timing the release to maximize the young cat's chances of survival. The kits would be released separately, in different locations appropriate to their personalities and skills, mimicking what would happen naturally as young bobcats dispersed from their mother's territory. Cascade herself presented a more complicated question. Her history of human-caused trauma and the extensive medical intervention she'd received made Rachel worry about her ability to readjust to completely wild living. The decision about Cascade's future weighed heavily on Rachel's mind as autumn approached Idaho with its spectacular display of changing colors. While her kits had grown strong and capable, demonstrating all the skills necessary for survival in the wild, Cascade herself presented a more nuanced situation. Her physical recovery had been complete for months, her lungs fully healed from the aspiration pneumonia, her body condition excellent after the successful rearing of her offspring. But the psychological scars from Gerald Pritchard's sustained abuse were harder to assess and impossible to fully heal. Rachel convened a meeting of wildlife experts to discuss Cascade's case, inviting specialists in bobcat behavior, rehabilitation ethics, and post-release monitoring. The group spent an entire day reviewing footage of Cascade's behavior in the sanctuary, analyzing her hunting success rates, her territorial behaviors, and most importantly, her responses to human presence during the minimal necessary interactions. The consensus was cautiously optimistic. Cascade had maintained her wild wariness of humans despite the medical care she'd received, and her maternal success demonstrated intact natural instincts. Marcus attended the meeting at Rachel's invitation, his unique perspective as both Cascade's rescuer and a retired wildlife professional, providing valuable input. He argued passionately for giving Cascade a chance at freedom, pointing out that she had fought so hard to survive and protect her kits that denying her the opportunity to live wild seemed like a betrayal of everything they'd worked for. But he also acknowledged the risks, the possibility that releasing her near human populations could end badly if she had been too traumatized to properly avoid dangerous situations. The experts developed a compromise plan that balanced Cascade's welfare against practical concerns. She would be released into a remote section of the Sawtooth National Forest, far from human habitation and Gerald Pritchard's property. The area had excellent bobcat habitat with abundant prey and minimal human activity beyond occasional backcountry hikers. Most critically, Cascade would be fitted with a GPS collar that would allow researchers to monitor her movements and behavior after release, providing data that could inform future rehabilitation decisions while ensuring they could intervene if she showed signs of struggling to adapt. The release timeline was set for late October, when Cascade's kits would be approximately 9 months old enough to survive independently, but young enough that they hadn't spent their entire lives in captivity. The weeks leading up to release were filled with preparation and emotion, Emily's documentary footage was edited into a compelling narrative that traced Cascade's journey from drowning victim to recovered mother, and the center planned to release the film simultaneously with the physical release of the Bobcats, using the publicity to continue fundraising for wildlife rehabilitation work. Marcus found himself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions as the release date approached. Pride in what had been accomplished mingled with anxiety about the unknowns ahead. He'd saved Cascade's life, but he couldn't protect her from every danger she would face in the wild. Starvation, injury, encounters with larger predators, harsh weather, and yes, other humans who might not share his respect for wildlife. All these threats awaited her beyond the sanctuary's protective boundaries. Letting go required a different kind of courage than the physical bravery he'd demonstrated during the underwater rescue. The first of Cascade's kits to be released was Summit, the bold male who had shown such exceptional hunting skills and territorial confidence. His release site was a rocky mountain area 30 miles from where his siblings would go, carefully chosen to match his preference for elevated terrain and his competitive nature. Rachel's team transported him in the early morning hours, timing the release for dawn when bobcats were naturally most active. The transport carrier was opened remotely, and Summit emerged cautiously, testing the air with his sensitive nose before moving with increasing confidence into the boulders and pine forests that would become his new territory. River was released 2 days later in a region rich with streams and riparian habitat, his fascination with water making him ideally suited for the area. Meadow went to a region of mixed forest and meadowland that offered the open hunting grounds she preferred. Shadow, the most cautious of the siblings, was placed in dense forest habitat that would provide the cover and security she seemed to need. Each release was documented by remote cameras and GPS collar data, allowing Rachel's team to monitor the young bobcats' initial adaptation to wild living without interfering in their adjustment process. Cascade's release was saved for last, scheduled for a crisp October morning when the mountains were dusted with the season's first light snow. Marcus had asked to be present, not to interfere, but simply to witness the final chapter of the story that had begun with his desperate dive into Lake Cascade. Rachel agreed, understanding that Marcus needed this closure, needed to see with his own eyes that the life he'd saved had led to freedom rather than permanent captivity. The transport to the release site took several hours, following Forest Service roads deep into wilderness areas where human presence was measured in visitors per month rather than per day. The location had been chosen with meticulous care, balancing remoteness against Cascade's need for adequate prey populations and suitable den sites. As they drove, Rachel briefed Marcus on what to expect. Cascade might emerge from the carrier immediately and disappear into the forest, or she might wait hours before venturing out. There was no way to predict how she would respond to this sudden expansion of her world. When they reached the designated release point, Rachel's team worked with quiet efficiency to position the carrier and set up remote monitoring equipment. Marcus stood at a respectful distance, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets against the morning chill, his eyes never leaving the carrier that held the bobcat he'd pulled from drowning darkness 9 months ago. The carrier door was opened remotely, the mechanism clicking softly in the mountain silence, and then everyone waited. Minutes passed with no movement from inside the carrier. Marcus began to worry that something was wrong, that perhaps Cascade was too frightened or disoriented to emerge. But Rachel, with her years of experience, recognized this hesitation as normal, a wild animal's caution when confronted with dramatic environmental change. She gestured for everyone to move farther back, reducing the human presence that might be keeping Cascade inside. The strategy worked. After perhaps 15 minutes of absolute stillness, Cascade appeared at the carrier door. She emerged slowly, every sense alert, her head swiveling to take in the vast forest that stretched in every direction. For a long moment, she stood completely still, and Marcus found himself holding his breath, wondering what she was thinking. What instincts and memories were processing this new reality? Then Cascade took her first steps into freedom, moving with the fluid grace that characterized her species, her spotted coat blending perfectly with the dappled shadows of the forest floor. She paused once more, perhaps 50 feet from the carrier, and turned to look back. Marcus would later swear that her golden eyes found his, that for just a second there was recognition in that gaze, an acknowledgement of the strange journey they'd shared. Then Cascade turned away and melted into the undergrowth, disappearing so completely that within seconds it was as if she'd never been there at all. Only the GPS collar data, transmitting her coordinates to Rachel's monitoring system, confirmed that she was real and moving steadily deeper into the wilderness. Marcus stood staring at the place where Cascade had vanished, long after the others had begun packing up equipment. Rachel approached him quietly, standing beside him in companionable silence for several minutes before speaking. She told him that the GPS data showed Cascade moving with purpose and confidence, exploring her new territory with the behavior patterns of a healthy wild bobcat. The collar would transmit for approximately 2 years before its battery died, giving them plenty of time to confirm her successful adaptation or to intervene if problems developed. As they drove back toward civilization, Marcus realized that he'd been transformed by this experience as profoundly as Cascade had been. He'd spent his career managing wildlife populations, making decisions based on data and policy and ecological principles. But Cascade had reminded him that behind every population statistic was an individual animal with its own will to survive, its own intelligence and adaptability, its own right to exist, free from human cruelty. The months following Cascade's release brought a steady stream of encouraging data that validated every difficult decision Rachel and her team had made. The GPS collar tracked Cascade's movements as she established a territory of approximately 12 square miles, a range typical for female bobcats in Idaho's mountain regions. She demonstrated excellent hunting success, with her movement patterns suggesting regular kills and feeding. Most remarkably, she showed absolutely no tendency to approach human structures or trails, maintaining the healthy wariness of people that would keep her safe from those who might wish her harm. Her 4 offspring showed equally promising adaptation to wild living. Summit had claimed a rocky territory that overlapped slightly with an older male bobcat's range, and the GPS data suggested they'd reach some kind of accommodation, possibly indicating that Summit was learning territorial boundaries from the more experienced cat. River's collar showed him ranging along a complex of streams and wetlands, his movements suggesting successful fishing and small mammal hunting. Meadow and Shadow, released without collars due to equipment limitations, were monitored through camera traps that occasionally captured their images, confirming their presence and apparently good health. The documentary that Emily had created premiered at a wildlife film festival in Montana, where it won awards for both its compelling narrative and its educational value. The film didn't shy away from the darkness of Cascade's story, showing in unflinching detail the cruelty she'd endured, but it balanced that darkness with the hope of her recovery and the dedication of everyone who'd fought to save her. Audiences left theaters moved to tears and inspired to action, with many immediately seeking ways to support wildlife rehabilitation efforts in their own communities. The film's wider release on streaming platforms brought Cascade's story to a global audience, generating media attention that Rachel had never anticipated. She found herself fielding interview requests from international news outlets, wildlife conservation organizations, and academic institutions interested in the rehabilitation protocols her team had developed. The attention was sometimes overwhelming, but Rachel recognized its value in advancing wildlife welfare causes and securing funding for future rehabilitation work that might otherwise go unfunded. Marcus became something of a reluctant celebrity himself, though he consistently deflected attention away from his role in the rescue, and toward the broader issues of wildlife conservation and the need for stronger protections against animal cruelty. He gave talks at schools and community groups throughout Idaho, using Cascade's story to teach about the importance of individual action and the responsibility humans had to protect the wildlife they shared the landscape with. His granddaughter Emily often accompanied him, and together they made a compelling argument for cross-generational cooperation in conservation efforts. Gerald Pritchard served his full prison sentence with no early release, and upon completion faced the reality of a lifetime ban on hunting and fishing in Idaho. For someone who had defined himself by his interactions with wildlife, even if those interactions had been characterized by violence and control, the ban was a punishment that extended far beyond the prison term. He relocated to another state after release, and while Rachel and Marcus occasionally wondered if he'd truly learned anything from his prosecution, they took comfort in knowing he could no longer harm Idaho's wildlife. The passage of Cascade's law created lasting change in how Idaho addressed wildlife crimes. The dedicated Wildlife Crime Investigation Unit proved its worth within its first year, solving several cases of poaching and animal cruelty that might have gone unprosecuted under the previous system. The rehabilitation funding that the law provided allowed centers like Rachel's to expand their capacity, taking in more animals and developing increasingly sophisticated protocols for different species and situations. 1 year after Cascade's release, Rachel organized a small gathering at the rehabilitation center to mark the anniversary of the rescue. Marcus was there, along with Emily, Sarah the technician who had documented everything so carefully, and several of the volunteers who had helped build the sanctuary. They watched the documentary together, seeing their own faces younger by a year, but their commitment unchanged, and they shared updates about Cascade and her offspring based on the latest GPS and camera trap data. The anniversary celebration was bittersweet when Rachel revealed that Cascade's GPS collar had recently stopped transmitting. The battery had lasted longer than expected, providing 14 months of invaluable data, but its silence meant they could no longer track her movements or confirm her well-being. Rachel emphasized that this was actually a positive development, that Cascade deserved to live completely free from human monitoring, but Marcus felt an unexpected pang of loss at this final severing of connection with the BOBCAT, who had changed so many lives. Then Rachel shared news that transformed that sense of loss into something approaching joy. Camera trap images from Cascade's last known territory had captured something extraordinary. A female bobcat matching Cascade's distinctive spot pattern had been photographed with 3 small kits, newborns judging by their size and the timing of the images. If the bobcat in the photos was indeed Cascade, and Rachel believed the probability was high, then she had not only survived her release but had thrived sufficiently to successfully mate and produce a second litter. The kits in those images represented the ultimate validation of everything they'd accomplished. Marcus studied the photographs with the careful attention he'd once brought to official wildlife surveys, and while he couldn't be absolutely certain the bobcat was Cascade, something in the animal's posture and the way she watched the camera with those intelligent golden eyes convinced him. This was her, living the life that Gerald Pritchard had tried to steal, raising another generation of wild bobcats who would grow up knowing nothing of human cruelty, only the freedom of Idaho's forests and mountains. The gathering evolved into a celebration of what was possible when humans chose compassion over cruelty, when individual action combined with professional expertise and community support. They talked late into the evening about other animals they'd helped, other battles they were fighting, other victories both small and large in the ongoing effort to protect wildlife. But the conversation kept returning to Cascade, to that August morning when Marcus had seen something struggling in the water and had chosen to act rather than to look away. As the gathering wound down and people began saying their goodbyes, Marcus found himself alone for a moment in the monitoring room where he'd spent so many hours watching Cascade and her kits. The screens were dark now, no longer showing the sanctuary that had been dismantled after the releases, its materials repurposed for other rehabilitation projects. But in his mind, Marcus could still see Cascade moving through that carefully crafted wilderness, could still remember the first time her kits had opened their eyes, could still feel the weight of her limp body in his arms as he'd fought to bring her back from drowning. He thought about the interconnectedness of it all, how his decision to dive into that lake had rippled outward in ways he never could have anticipated. 5 bobcats returned to the wild, potentially more if Cascade's second litter survived, a landmark court case that had strengthened wildlife protections across Idaho, a law that would save countless animals in years to come, a documentary that had inspired people around the world to care about wildlife they would never personally encounter. All of it traced back to one moment of decision, one choice to value life over convenience or safety. Rachel found him there, lost in reflection, and they stood together in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke. She told him that Cascade's case had fundamentally changed how she approached rehabilitation, had reminded her that the goal was never just survival but the restoration of wildness and dignity. Every animal that came through the center's doors now received care informed by lessons learned from Cascade's journey. In that sense, Rachel said, Cascade was still teaching them, still making a difference, even as she lived her life free from human observation in the mountains she called home. Marcus nodded, accepting the truth of that statement. As he prepared to leave, stepping out into the Idaho night where stars blazed in the clear mountain air, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the strange and difficult and ultimately beautiful journey that had begun with a drowning bobcat and ended with freedom. Somewhere out in the darkness, in forests he would probably never visit, Cascade was living the life she deserved. And that, Marcus realized, was the only ending that mattered.